The auction hall buzzed with the excited chatter of a dozen different alien species, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electronic pulses that would have been overwhelming to human ears. But there were no human ears left to be overwhelmed. At least, that's what they all believed. Commander Zexhai of the Vrex Empire adjusted his ceremonial armor as he surveyed the crowded marketplace. The great domed structure on Kepler Station stretched high above them, its transparent walls offering a view of the star-dotted void beyond. This was the largest slave auction in the sector, and today promised to be especially profitable. The recent conquest of the third planet in the Sol system had yielded some interesting specimens before the world was properly sterilized. "Lot 779, announced the auctioneer, a tall, insectoid creature whose mandibles clicked rhythmically as it spoke through its translation device. "One human juvenile, female, approximately 8 standard cycles old. Last known survivor from the Terra campaign." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Humans had been an oddity in the galactic community even before their extinction. They were neither the strongest nor the fastest species. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards, and they possessed no psychic abilities worth mentioning. Yet something about them had made the Galactic Council nervous enough to authorize their complete elimination. The child was brought out on a small, hovering platform, her small form looking even tinier, surrounded by the massive alien bidders. She had dark hair that fell in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her eyes were the deep brown color that had been common among her extinct species. More interesting to the buyers was her apparent docility. She sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap, showing none of the aggressive tendencies that had made adult humans so troublesome. The specimen shows no signs of the neural defects that plagued the adult population, the auctioneer continued, its voice carrying easily through the hall's acoustic enhancement system. Preliminary scans indicate high intelligence and adaptability. She has been taught basic galactic standard and shows remarkable learning capacity. Zexhai leaned forward in his viewing box, studying the small creature with professional interest. His own species, the Vrex, were master geneticists and bioengineers. A human specimen, especially one young enough to be properly shaped, could prove invaluable for their research. The adult humans had shown disturbing resistance to their mental conditioning techniques, but a child might be more malleable. "The bidding will start at 5,000 credits, announced the auctioneer. Immediately, hands and appendages of various shapes shot up around the hall. The price climbed rapidly as representatives from mining corporations, research facilities, and private collectors competed for the rare prize. Zexhai waited patiently, knowing that most of these initial bidders would drop out once the price reached truly significant levels. In the slave pen, the human child sat motionless, but her eyes moved constantly, taking in everything around her. The aliens surrounding her had no idea that she understood far more than they suspected. During the long journey from Earth's ruins to this auction house, she had listened to countless conversations, absorbing not just the words, but the emotional undertones that came with each species' particular way of speaking. Her name was Aria, though she hadn't spoken it aloud since the day the silver ships had come screaming down from Earth's sky. She had been hiding in the ruins of what had once been the new Sydney Opera House when the salvage crews found her, clutching a small device that the aliens had dismissed as a primitive toy. They couldn't have known it was her father's old music player, loaded with thousands of songs from across human history. The bidding had reached 50,000 credits now, and only a handful of serious buyers remained. Zexhai finally raised one clawed hand, his bid jumping the price to 75,000. Several other bidders dropped out immediately, recognizing the Virex military insignia on his uniform and knowing they couldn't compete with the Empire's resources. 80,000, called out a new voice, and Zexhai turned to see a representative from the Crystalline Collective, their geometric form glittering under the auction hall's lights. The collective were known for their appreciation of beautiful and rare objects, treating sentient beings more like living art pieces than slaves. 100,000, Zexhai responded without hesitation. The crystalline representative hesitated, their form shifting through several color patterns that indicated deep consideration. The collective valued beauty above profit, but even they had limits to what they would pay for a single specimen. 125,000, came another bid, this time from a Dolthak merchant whose species was notorious for their brutal entertainment industries. Zexhai's mandibles clicked in annoyance. The Dolthak would use the child for gladiatorial combat or worse, and the specimen would be dead within a year. 200,000, Zexhai declared, his voice carrying enough authority to make several nearby aliens step back nervously. The auction hall fell silent. 200,000 credits was more than most ships cost, and definitely more than anyone expected to pay for a single human, even the last one. The auctioneer's mandibles quivered with excitement at the unprecedented price. "Any other bids?" the auctioneer called out, its voice practically vibrating with glee. "Going once, going twice." That's when Aria began to hum. It started so softly that only the nearest aliens noticed at first, a simple melody that seemed to drift through the air like a gentle breeze. But as the sound spread through the auction hall's acoustic systems, something extraordinary began to happen. The humming grew stronger, and Aria's voice rose with it. She wasn't singing in Galactic Standard or any known language. She was singing in the ancient human language of music itself, wordless, but somehow carrying meaning that transcended the need for translation. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Bidding hands lowered slowly. Even the auctioneer's mandibles ceased their nervous clicking. Every alien in the hall found themselves drawn into the melody, their different sensory organs picking up harmonics and frequencies that spoke directly to something deep within them. For the Vrex, whose species experienced emotions as chemical cascades, the music triggered a response pattern they had never felt before. It was like tasting a new flavor or seeing a new color. For the Crystalline Collective representative, the sound waves created visual patterns that were somehow more beautiful than anything in their vast collections. The Dolthak, whose neural structure was built around aggression and dominance, felt their violent impulses simply fade away, replaced by something they had no name for. Aria's voice grew stronger, and with it came harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from a single throat. The music seemed to pull memories from the listeners, not their own memories, but older ones. Ancestral memories buried so deep in their genetic codes that they had forgotten they existed. Zexhai found himself seeing flashes of his species' distant past, before they had become the militaristic empire they were now. He saw Vrex working together to build great cities of living coral, their technology growing organically from their understanding of biological systems rather than being forced into rigid mechanical forms. He saw his ancestors singing their own songs under alien stars before conquest had become their primary form of expression. Around the hall, similar revelations were occurring. The Kythera insectoids remembered when their hives had been full of individual creativity rather than mindless obedience. The Centauri recalled when their psychic abilities had been used for healing and connection rather than domination and control. Even the artificial intelligences present found their logic matrices responding to patterns they couldn't analyze but somehow understood. Aria's song wove through the auction hall like a living thing, touching each alien present and showing them glimpses of who they had been before fear and ambition had shaped them into what they were now. It wasn't magic or technology or psychic manipulation. It was something much simpler and much more powerful. It was the pure expression of a species that had faced extinction and chosen to respond not with hatred or despair, but with the very thing that made them most human, their art. The music reached its crescendo, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, every being in the auction hall experienced perfect harmony. Not the imposed peace of conquered subjects, but the willing cooperation of individuals choosing to create something beautiful together. When the last note faded into silence, the auction hall remained still. Thousands of aliens from dozens of species sat in absolute quiet, each processing what they had just experienced. Many were weeping, though their tears took forms ranging from liquid to crystalline to pure energy. HFY looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking. In his long military career, he had conquered worlds and destroyed civilizations, always telling himself it was for the greater good of galactic order. But now he understood what they had really destroyed when they sterilized Earth. They had eliminated the last source of something that his species, that all their species, desperately needed. They had destroyed the beings who remembered how to sing. The silence in the auction hall stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, the assembled aliens began to stir. But something fundamental had changed. The aggressive posturing, the casual cruelty, the dismissive attitudes that had characterized their interactions moments before seemed to have evaporated along with the last notes of Arya's song. HFY was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with emotion he didn't fully understand. "The auction is canceled," he announced, his words carrying across the hall's amplification system. Around him, his fellow Vrex officers looked shocked. Canceling a legal auction was unprecedented, potentially illegal, depending on how the station authorities chose to interpret it. "Commander?" questioned his aide, Sub-Commander Krell, whose own voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before the song. "The protocols require—" "Forget the protocols," HFY said quietly, never taking his eyes off the small human girl. She was looking directly at him now, and in her brown eyes he saw something that made his hearts race. Recognition. Not just awareness, but actual understanding of what had just occurred. The auctioneer, still frozen in place, managed to activate its translation device with a shaking appendage. "This is irregular," it stammered. "The bidding was legitimate. Legal contracts must be honored. Station authority requires no." The word came from an unexpected source, the crystalline collective representative. Its geometric form had shifted from the sharp, angular configuration that indicated business dealings to something softer, more curved. "The child is not property to be sold." This statement caused a ripple of shocked murmurs throughout the hall. The crystalline collective was known for their vast collections of rare and beautiful objects, including sentient beings they treated as living artwork. For them to declare anything not property was revolutionary. Dr. Velntar, a hegemony scientist who had been bidding for research purposes, stood up slowly from her seat. Her species, the Kalahari, were known for their analytical minds and emotional coldness, but now her usually steady voice wavered as she spoke. "What we just experienced, it wasn't just music. It was a form of communication our species lost millennia ago." She turned to address the hall, her 6 eyes blinking in sequence as she processed what she was saying. "Before we developed technological telepathy, before we relied on neural linking and digital consciousness transfer, my ancestors communicated through harmonic resonance, songs that carried not just information, but emotional truth." She paused, her breathing apparatus cycling rapidly. "I had only read about it in ancient texts. I never believed it was real until now." Similar revelations were occurring throughout the hall. Species after species began to recognize what they had lost in their rush toward technological advancement and galactic dominance. The Kithara Queen, representing one of the most rigidly hierarchical hive-mind species in known space, was actually crying, something that hadn't been witnessed by outsiders in over 1,000 years. "My drones," she whispered, her complex vocalization system creating harmonies that her species hadn't produced since their civilization's earliest days. "They used to sing. Before the efficiency protocols, before the unity commands, they used to create individual songs. I remember now. I remember their voices." Arya remained silent through all of this, but she was far from passive. She was studying each species' reaction, cataloging their responses, learning how her father's gift had affected them. The music player hidden in her clothing contained not just Earth's musical heritage, but thousands of recordings her father had made during his work as a xenoanthropologist. Before the war, before the fear and hatred, he had studied alien cultures and had theorized that music might be the universal language that could bridge the gaps between species. He had been right, but he had never lived to see it proven. The station's security forces were beginning to mobilize, their heavy footsteps echoing through the corridors leading to the auction hall. The cancellation of a legal auction would bring investigators and, eventually, the Galactic Council itself. HFY knew that once the bureaucrats arrived, the child would be processed through official channels, probably ending up in a research facility or military installation where her unique abilities could be studied and exploited. "We need to leave," he said, stepping down from his viewing box toward the auction platform. "All of us. Now." "Commander," Krell warned, "interfering with station operations, removing auction property without proper documentation." "She's not property," HFY repeated, echoing the crystalline representative's words. As he spoke, he realized he truly meant it. The concept of owning another sentient being, something he had accepted without question his entire military career, now seemed not just wrong, but impossible to contemplate. Dr. Velentar was already moving, her research team gathering their equipment. "My ship has advanced medical facilities," she offered. "The child needs proper care, not whatever basic sustenance they've been providing." "My vessel has superior defensive capabilities," countered the Kithara Queen, her multiple voices speaking in harmony. "And my hive ship carries representatives from 47 different species. She should meet them. She should sing for them." Other voices joined in, each offering assistance, protection, resources. The same aliens who had been competing to purchase Arya minutes before were now competing to help her. But their motivations had fundamentally shifted. Instead of seeking to own or control her, they wanted to learn from her, to rediscover the parts of themselves they had lost. Arya finally spoke, her voice small but clear in the momentarily quiet hall. "I want to go to the dead places," she said in perfect galactic standard, her pronunciation better than many adult aliens achieved. The statement sent a chill through the assembled crowd. The dead places was the common term for the ruins left behind by extinct civilizations throughout the galaxy. There were thousands of them, worlds where species had once thrived before war, disaster, or simply the passage of time had claimed them. "Why?" Dr. Velentar asked gently, her scientific curiosity warring with a newfound protective instinct toward the child. "Because they're not really dead," Arya replied. "My father told me that. He said civilizations leave echoes, like songs that keep playing even after the singer is gone. He said if someone knew how to listen, they could still hear them." HFY felt his blood run cold. If the child could somehow access the cultural memories of extinct species, the implications were staggering. The Galactic Council's records contained references to civilizations with technologies far beyond anything currently available. Species that had mastered faster-than-light travel without massive energy expenditures, others that had achieved perfect ecological balance, still others that had developed forms of consciousness that transcended physical form. "The Valthorn ruins," whispered the crystalline representative, its form shifting through patterns that indicated deep excitement. They mastered dimensional engineering before they vanished. If their cultural echoes still exist. The Nethys Collective, added Dr. Velentar. They solved the consciousness transfer problem without losing individual identity. The Harmony Worlds, breathed the Kythera Queen. Legend says they achieved perfect unity without sacrificing creativity or free will. But their planning was interrupted by the arrival of station security. Heavy combat units, flanked by administrative officials, poured into the auction hall, their weapons powered and ready. The lead officer, a hegemony enforcer with the cold efficiency that species was known for, activated his amplified voice system. This auction is under official review, he announced. All participants will remain in place for questioning. The contested property will be returned to authorized custody pending resolution of legal disputes. The contested property he referred to was, of course, Aria. She would be taken into official custody, processed through the system, and eventually delivered to whoever had the strongest legal claim or the most political influence. It was exactly the fate HFY had hoped to prevent. That's when the most unexpected intervention occurred. The auctioneer itself, the insectoid being who had been selling Aria only minutes before, stepped between the child and the security forces. The auction has been withdrawn by the sellers, it announced, its translation device broadcasting to every communication frequency in use. Impossible, the lead enforcer replied. Legal auctions cannot be unilaterally withdrawn without. The Terran Recovery Consortium has formally withdrawn all human-related assets from sale, effective immediately, the auctioneer continued, its mandibles clicking in a pattern that indicated absolute certainty. All documentation is in order. All licensing fees have been returned. The auction house bears no liability for the change in vendor policy. This was a complete fabrication. There was no Terran Recovery Consortium, and the salvage rights to Earth had been distributed among dozens of different military and corporate entities. But the auctioneer was buying them time, and everyone in the hall understood it. More importantly, they all understood why it was doing so. The song had affected everyone present, including the auctioneer itself. It had remembered something its species had lost, some form of beauty or connection that had been sacrificed in the pursuit of profit. The lead enforcer wasn't convinced, but bureaucracy had its own momentum. Investigating the documentation would take time, and questioning the auctioneer's authority would require higher-level authorization. While he and his units tried to sort through the legal implications, the auction hall's participants began to disperse. HFY moved quickly to Aria's platform, offering his hand to help her down. She accepted it without hesitation, her small fingers warm against his armored palm. Around them, the other aliens were forming an unofficial escort, their previous competitive hostility replaced by collaborative protection. "Where will you take her?" Dr. Velentar asked as they moved toward the exit. "Away from here," HFY replied. "Away from bureaucrats and administrators and anyone who still thinks she's property to be allocated." "The Vrex Empire will hunt you down," Krell warned his commander. "They'll consider this desertion. Treason." HFY looked down at Aria, who was walking calmly between him and Dr. Velentar as if she trusted them completely. Her presence seemed to radiate a peace that he had never experienced in his long military career. "Then let them hunt," he said quietly. "I've spent my entire life serving an empire that destroys beauty. I won't do it anymore." As they reached the auction hall's exit, Aria looked back at the chaos they were leaving behind. Security forces were arguing with vendors, administrators were demanding documentation that didn't exist, and aliens from dozens of species were quietly slipping away to spread word of what they had witnessed. "They'll follow us," she said matter-of-factly. "Yes," HFY agreed. "Does that frighten you?" Aria considered this seriously, then shook her head. "No. I know how this story ends." "How?" Dr. Velentar asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. Arya smiled for the first time since the auction had begun, and in that expression was something that had been missing from the galaxy for far too long. Hope. "Everyone gets to remember who they used to be," she said. "Everyone gets to sing again." As they disappeared into the station's crowded corridors, none of them noticed the small recording device that had been broadcasting their entire conversation across subspace communication networks. Word was already spreading throughout the galaxy about the human child who could awaken something that had been lost, and not all of those who heard the story would welcome its implications. 3 months after the auction that changed the galaxy, the Galactic Council found itself facing the greatest crisis in its 10,000-year history. What had started as a single child's song had spread like wildfire across thousands of worlds, and the carefully maintained order of galactic civilization was beginning to crumble. Not through war or rebellion, but through something far more dangerous: remembering. High Admiral Vex Thor of the Hegemony Fleet studied the reports streaming across his command displays with growing alarm. Entire star systems were going offline, not from conquest or disaster, but from what the analysts were calling cultural reversion events. Species that had been perfectly compliant members of galactic society for millennia were suddenly abandoning their assigned roles and returning to ancient practices that the Council had worked so hard to suppress. The Kythera hives had stopped producing the industrial quantities of manufactured goods that supplied half the galaxy. Instead, their workers were creating individual art pieces, each drone expressing personal creativity that hadn't been seen since before their species' integration into the galactic economy. The Crystalline Collective had opened their private hoards to public viewing, transforming their worlds into galleries where beauty was celebrated rather than hoarded. Even the warlike Dolthak had laid down their weapons and were teaching their children the ancestral hunting songs that had been replaced by military marching codes. "Where is she now?" Vex Thor demanded of his intelligence chief, a cybernetically enhanced being whose species had long ago replaced most of their biological components with mechanical ones. "The child continues to move through the Outer Rim territories," the intelligence chief reported, his mechanical voice devoid of the emotion that seemed to be infecting everyone else. "Commander Zexhi's ship has been joined by vessels from 47 different species. They're not attempting to hide their movements. In fact, they're broadcasting their location openly and inviting others to join them." This was the most infuriating aspect of the entire situation. The child and her protectors weren't behaving like fugitives. They traveled openly from system to system, welcomed by planetary governments that should have arrested them on sight. Instead, local authorities were treating their arrival as a celebration. "What's their current destination?" Vex Thor asked. The intelligence chief paused, his optical sensors flickering as he accessed real-time data. "The Veilthorn ruins, sir. They've been in that system for 3 days now." Vex Thor felt his blood chill. The Veilthorn ruins were the remnants of one of the most advanced civilizations in galactic history. The Veilthorn had developed technologies that the current galactic powers still couldn't fully understand before their mysterious disappearance 5,000 years ago. Their worlds had been declared off-limits archaeological sites, studied only by small teams of approved researchers. "Prepare the fleet," Vex Thor ordered. "Full combat deployment." "Sir," his tactical officer interjected, "intelligence reports indicate no hostile activity in the Veilthorn system." The assembled ships appeared to be conducting some form of archaeological expedition. "I don't care what they appear to be doing," Vex Thor snapped. "This child represents a clear threat to galactic stability. Her influence has already disrupted 17 major trade routes and caused productivity drops on 43 industrial worlds. If she gains access to Veilthorn technology—" He was interrupted by an incoming transmission from the communication array. The signal was being broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously, indicating either a technical malfunction or someone with access to incredibly sophisticated equipment. "This is Arya," came a clear young voice that every being in the galaxy was beginning to recognize. "I'm calling from the Veilthorn homeworld. There's something here I want to show everyone." The transmission included visual data, showing the child standing in what appeared to be a vast crystalline chamber deep beneath the planet's surface. Around her, the walls seemed to pulse with a soft internal light that shifted through colors that had no names in any current language. But more striking than the alien architecture were the beings standing with her. Dr. Velntar was there, along with Zexhai and the Kithara Queen, but they had been joined by dozens of others, scientists, artists, explorers, and ordinary beings from species across the galaxy. All of them were staring at something off-camera with expressions of wonder and revelation. "The Veilthorn left us a message," Arya continued, her voice carrying a joy that was infectious even through the transmission. "Not in words or images, but in music. They knew someday someone would come who could hear it properly." The camera view shifted to show what they were looking at, a massive crystalline structure that rose from the chamber's floor like a frozen symphony. As they watched, Arya approached it and placed her small hand on its surface. The result was immediate and spectacular. The crystal began to resonate, producing sounds that were felt as much as heard. But these weren't just random tones. They were melodies, harmonies, entire symphonies that had been encoded into the very structure of the monument. And as the music played, something extraordinary happened. The chamber walls became transparent, revealing not the underground cavern they appeared to be in, but a vast city that stretched to the horizon. Buildings of impossible beauty spiraled into the sky, their architecture defying conventional understanding of physics and engineering. Parks and gardens bloomed between them, filled with life forms that glowed with their own internal light. "It's still here," Arya breathed, her voice full of wonder. "The city isn't dead. It's sleeping." The beings in the chamber weren't the only ones seeing this revelation. The transmission was being received across the galaxy, and on world after world, beings stopped what they were doing to watch. Factory workers abandoned their assembly lines, soldiers put down their weapons, government officials left their meetings. Everyone was watching as a human child awakened a dead civilization. The music grew stronger, and with it came understanding. The Veilthorn hadn't disappeared or died out. They had transcended physical existence, but they had left their city behind as a gift for whoever came after them. A working example of what galactic civilization could become if it chose cooperation over dominance, creativity over efficiency, beauty over profit. On his command ship, High Admiral Vexthor watched the transmission with growing horror. This wasn't just archaeological discovery. This was revolution. If other species saw what the Veilthorn had achieved, if they understood that such cooperation was possible, the entire structure of galactic government would collapse. "All ships prepare to engage," he ordered. "Target the archaeological site. Full bombardment." His tactical officer's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Sir, there are 47 vessels in that system representing most major galactic species. An attack would be an act of war against pirates and traitors," Vexthor finished. "They're harboring a dangerous fugitive and interfering with council authority. We have legal justification." But even as he gave the orders, Vexthor knew something was wrong. Several of his ship captains were requesting clarification of orders. Others were reporting technical difficulties with their weapons systems. And in the background of every communication, barely audible but definitely present, was music. The song from the Veilthorn ruins was being broadcast not just to civilian populations, but to every ship, station, and facility in the galaxy. And just as it had in the auction hall months before, it was having an effect. Captain Mordak of the heavy cruiser Vengeance was the first to disobey direct orders. "I will not fire on archaeologists," she announced over the fleet communication system. "I will not fire on children." Her defection triggered others. Within minutes, half of Vex Thor's fleet was refusing to engage. The other half was reporting system malfunctions that were clearly deliberate sabotage by their own crews. "This is mutiny!" Vex Thor raged, but his words seemed hollow even to himself. As he spoke, he could feel the same strange stirring that had affected everyone who heard Arya's song. Memories of his own species past, before they had become the military arm of galactic government. Images of hegemony worlds where art and learning had flourished before being sacrificed to the demands of empire. On the Valethorn homeworld, Arya stepped away from the crystal monument and looked directly into the camera. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed impossible from someone so young. "The Valethorn left instructions," she said, "not just about their technology, but about how to use it. They knew that someday the galaxy would need to remember how to work together again. They knew that all the different species would need to find their way back to who they used to be." She paused, and when she continued, her words were directed at every being listening across the galaxy. They also knew that one species would have to help everyone else remember, a species that would stay connected to music and art and beauty even when everything else was lost, a species that would choose to sing instead of surrender, even when they were the last ones left. The implication was clear. Humanity hadn't been destroyed because they were weak or primitive. They had been targeted for extinction because they were the key to galactic transformation. Their art, their music, their stubborn refusal to abandon beauty even in the face of annihilation. These weren't weaknesses. They were the tools needed to heal a galaxy that had forgotten how to be truly alive. "But I'm not the last human," Arya continued, and for the first time since the transmission began, she smiled. "There are others, hidden on worlds that the Council never found, living in communities that the fleets missed. And now they know it's safe to come out. They know they're not alone anymore." Across the galaxy, the response was immediate. On worlds that had been declared completely sterilized, human voices began to answer. Small communities that had hidden underground or in remote wilderness areas started broadcasting their own songs. Research stations that had secretly preserved human prisoners released them and asked for forgiveness. Even on Earth itself, automated systems that had been thought destroyed began transmitting the music and art that had been saved in deep storage archives. Humanity wasn't extinct. They had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. High Admiral Vex Thor found himself thinking about his own homeworld, about the gardens his grandmother had tended before they were paved over to make room for military training facilities. He thought about the poems his people used to write before efficiency protocols declared them a waste of time. He thought about who the hegemony could have been if they had chosen a different path. Slowly, he reached out and powered down his ship's weapon systems. "Fleet, stand down," he ordered, his voice hoarse with emotion he was only beginning to understand. "All vessels return to port for reassignment." The last part wasn't entirely true. There would be no reassignment, because there would be no more fleets assembled for conquest. The galaxy was about to change in ways that made military dominance irrelevant. On the Valethorn homeworld, Arya placed her hand on the crystal monument one more time. But now, instead of awakening sleeping music, she was adding to it. Her voice joined with the ancient harmonies, and through the galactic communication network, other voices joined as well. Human voices from hidden communities, but also Vrex voices, Kithara voices, crystalline harmonic patterns, and sounds from species across the galaxy. For the first time in galactic history, every sentient being in known space was singing the same song. Not because they were forced to, not because they had been conquered or controlled, but because they chose to. Because they remembered what it felt like to create something beautiful together. And in that moment of perfect harmony, something unprecedented happened. The barriers between species dissolved, not their individuality or their unique characteristics, but the fear and mistrust that had kept them apart. The economic systems that reduced sentient beings to commodities collapsed and were replaced by networks of cooperation and mutual aid. The military hierarchies that maintained order through force were abandoned as beings found better ways to organize themselves. The galaxy didn't become a utopia overnight. There were still problems to solve, still conflicts to resolve, still differences to navigate. But for the first time in thousands of years, every species in galactic civilization was working together to find solutions instead of fighting each other for dominance. And at the center of it all was a small human girl who had never stopped believing that music could change everything. Arya would spend the rest of her long life traveling between worlds, teaching others to listen for the songs that all civilizations left behind. She helped found the Harmony Collective, a galactic organization dedicated to preserving and sharing the cultural heritage of all species. She discovered dozens of extinct human communities and helped them reintegrate with galactic society. Most importantly, she taught an entire galaxy how to sing. But her greatest achievement was the simplest one. She proved that humanity's gift to the universe wasn't their technology or their conquests or their efficiency. It was their absolute refusal to let beauty die, even when everything else was lost. Even when they were the last ones left to sing, humans had kept singing. And in doing so, they had saved everyone else's songs too.